The billionaire's son had only 2 months left to live. What the maid did next left his father in tears. Ethan Hayes was only 6 years old, the only child of billionaire Richard Hayes. He had been cheerful and playful, always running around the mansion with boundless energy. But one morning, after weeks of strange fevers and overwhelming exhaustion, his body gave way. Doctors ran test after test, and the results carried a weight that no father could bear. They revealed a rare, aggressive form of cancer, one that seemed to have no mercy. Chemotherapy was tried, but it failed. Immunotherapy was attempted, but his body resisted it. Even experimental trials that Richard was willing to pay millions for could not hold back the relentless spread of the disease. The doctor sat down with Richard in a quiet hospital office and spoke softly but firmly. Ethan's body wasn't responding. He had maybe 2 months left. Money could buy the most advanced treatments, but it could not buy time. For a man who had spent his life believing that every door could be opened with wealth, this truth left him shattered. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next powerful story. From that day on, the hospital became their second home. The long, sterile hallways, the steady beeping of machines, and the sharp smell of antiseptic became part of their daily rhythm. Ethan never complained too much. Children often hide their bravery in small gestures. He asked for simple things: a breakfast that didn't taste like medicine, a cartoon that ended happily, and his father sitting beside him as he fell asleep. Richard read the same old storybook night after night, laughing at the lines they both knew by heart, holding his son's hand tightly as though that grip could keep him here longer. Behind Richard's calm face, however, lived a torment he could not show. Years earlier, his wife Hannah had died giving birth to Ethan. That wound had never healed, and now the thought of losing his son reopened the same pain, sharper than before. At home, a single framed photograph of Hannah still stood on a wooden shelf, her hands resting on her pregnant belly, smiling at the future she never got to meet. Ethan sometimes looked at that picture and asked gentle questions. What songs did his mother like? Did she tell stories like his father? What food made her happy? Richard answered carefully, offering short, soft memories without letting his grief spill into the words. Ethan nodded, almost as if he already understood that some people can only be kept alive through stories. He didn't get angry about it. He simply accepted that this was part of his life. But acceptance was not the same as giving up. Each new treatment carried a spark of hope, like a candle flickering in the night. And every time the numbers refused to improve, that spark burned out, leaving smoke behind. Doctors met Richard privately, showing scans, explaining that the tumor was spreading faster. His son had, at best, 2 months left. Richard stood by the glass window, looking at his sleeping boy, and his mind flooded with moments he knew would never come. He would never see Ethan walk into his first school classroom, never watch him graduate, never see him as a grown man standing proudly at his wedding. The list was endless, and each thought felt like another weight pressing down on his chest. Then one morning, Ethan asked for something unexpected. He didn't ask about being sick. He didn't ask how long he had left. Instead, with his voice soft but clear, his eyes shining with a child's innocence, he asked, "Dad, can I have a birthday party? A real one with balloons, a cake, some games, and a blue crown. I don't want much, just that." Richard stared at him, and in that moment he understood that his son's wish wasn't childish. It was his way of deciding how to live with the time he had. If days were limited, then at least one of them should be filled with joy. Richard nodded, promising that Ethan would have the most beautiful birthday party anyone had ever seen. The mansion, once quiet, now pulsed with footsteps of caretakers and the shuffle of medication schedules pinned to the fridge. Boxes of syringes and medical supplies filled the kitchen. But in the middle of all the chaos, there was one constant presence: Maria Lopez, the maid. She had been there since the day Ethan was born. At first, she had been hired for cleaning, cooking, and laundry, but after Hannah's death, her role changed completely. Maria fed Ethan when he cried as a baby, soothed his fevers, brushed his hair each morning, and read him bedtime stories every night until his little eyes closed. When Ethan was about 4, he looked up at her one day and called her Mommy Number 2. No one had taught him that, It came naturally from knowing who stayed by his side when the nights grew long. And from that day the name stuck. Richard always held on to his rule that staff were staff. But rules don't comfort a child when the fever spikes at midnight. And every time Ethan called for Maria instead of the nurses, the invisible line between family and employee faded. Maria never asked for recognition, never demanded more pay, never pushed for a title. She simply stayed, through the tears, through the treatments, through the darkest nights. Her loyalty had roots. Years earlier, Maria had lost her own younger brother to an illness because her family couldn't afford treatment. That loss left a scar, and she had silently promised that if she ever had the chance, she would not let another child suffer alone. When Hannah died and Ethan was left without a mother, that promise became her mission. Now, as the treatments failed and the countdown of weeks grew shorter, Maria remained steady. She adjusted Ethan's pillow when he couldn't find comfort, held his hand when needles pierced his skin, and listened to every small story he had the strength to tell. And in Ethan's drawings there were always two figures: his late mother from the photo frame and Maria, standing beside him, holding his hand. Richard saw it all. He didn't always speak of it, but he knew. And though it stung that his son sometimes turned to Maria more naturally than to him, he was grateful. Deep down he knew he could not fill the role of both father and mother alone. Maria had done what no amount of wealth could buy. She had given Ethan the comfort of a mother's love. The days inched forward, heavy with medication schedules and hospital visits. But now a new light had entered the mansion. Ethan's request for a birthday party was more than just a wish. It was a chance for joy in the middle of heartbreak. And Richard, along with Maria, would stop at nothing to give him that. The request for a birthday party changed the rhythm of the Hayes household. Instead of living only by the ticking of hospital machines and the shuffle of nurses, there was now something to look forward to. Richard, usually consumed by business meetings and contracts, found himself calling event planners, bakers, and decorators. Yet even with his billions he didn't want a grand, flashy celebration. This was not about impressing guests. It was about fulfilling Ethan's simple wish. Blue became the theme. A paper crown for his son, blue ribbons across the walls, balloons tied in clusters, and a cake that looked cheerful but soft enough for a boy weakened by treatments. The plan was to host the party in the hospital's recreation room so Ethan wouldn't miss any care, but it would still feel like a real celebration. Richard couldn't hide his nerves. He wasn't sure if Ethan would have the strength to enjoy it, and part of him feared that planning a party so close to the truth of his prognosis felt almost cruel. But when he looked into his son's eyes that still carried joy despite the pain, he knew this was the right choice. Maria became the backbone of the preparations. She measured Ethan's energy each day, deciding what activities would be too much and which ones he could enjoy. She suggested simple games: drawing, sticker puzzles, and bubble blowing. Nothing that will tire him, she reminded Richard. She ordered a small suit for Ethan, soft fabric that wouldn't irritate his fragile skin, and a tiny blue crown that looked more playful than heavy. The days leading up to the party were filled with quiet anticipation. Nurses smiled more, speaking of balloons instead of test results. Ethan asked about the cake nearly every morning, wondering if it would have stars made of sugar. He wanted to invite his classmates, but Maria gently suggested only a few close friends. Too many people would overwhelm him. Ethan agreed, his smile never fading. When the morning of the party arrived, the recreation room was transformed. The walls shimmered with blue streamers and silver stars. A long white table held a cake covered with soft cream and tiny sugar flowers. Nurses hung paper lanterns, while one of them carefully placed the crown on a tray as though preparing it for royalty. Richard stood at the entrance, greeting families as they arrived. Parents carried cards, children clutched stuffed animals and handmade drawings. They approached softly, their voices lowered out of instinct, as if afraid to disturb the fragile magic in the room. Ethan sat in his wheelchair, his head bald from treatment but his eyes glowing brighter than ever. The blue crown rested neatly on his lap until Maria placed it gently on his head. He grinned, looking every bit the birthday king he longed to be. When friends bent down to hug him, laughter spilled from his lips, frosting smudging his cheeks. Maria stayed close, cutting slices of cake into small pieces, offering him water when he grew tired, fixing his posture when his body leaned. The room was filled with soft music, children's songs that everyone recognized. Bubbles floated through the air and kids giggled as they chased them. One boy whispered in Ethan's ear about his pet dog learning a new trick, and Ethan laughed so hard Maria had to wipe tears of joy from his eyes. But then, in the middle of the games, Ethan looked at Maria with a seriousness that seemed too heavy for a child. He tilted his head, his small voice cutting through the chatter. "Am I going to live, Mommy?" The entire room fell silent. The music seemed to vanish. Parents froze, nurses glanced at each other, and even Richard, standing near the doorway, pressed both hands to his face and turned aside. This was the question every adult had dreaded, but it had come from the birthday boy himself, wearing a blue crown, frosting still on his lips. Maria's breath caught in her chest. For a moment her lungs felt empty, but her hands stayed steady as she held Ethan's fingers. She looked into his dark, unwavering eyes and whispered, "You are very strong. And Mommy is right here." It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was a promise that he wouldn't face this fight alone. The room stayed hushed, but eventually the party picked back up, softer than before. The children played quietly, parents whispered, and the games continued. Ethan still smiled when his classmates pushed his wheelchair around, still posed for pictures, still waved goodbye to every guest. But through it all he never once let go of Maria's hand. When the last guest left and the balloons began to sag, the room returned to its usual hospital quiet. Yet now it carried the sweet scent of cake instead of antiseptic. That night, Maria helped Ethan out of his party clothes, brushed his teeth and tucked him in. She told him a story about a prince who wore a paper crown and was stronger than any knight in the land. Ethan laughed, whispering that his paper crown felt lighter than a golden one. He hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "I want to live." Maria nodded, her voice steady. "I know." She lay beside him until his breathing evened out, and when she finally stood, she found Richard watching silently from the doorway. Neither spoke. Both knew that life had shifted in that moment. Pretending was no longer possible. Every remaining day had to be lived with purpose. And as the house fell into quiet once again, Maria sat alone in the kitchen, her heart restless. She opened her old laptop, searching for hope beyond what the doctors had said. And there, in the glow of the screen, a new possibility appeared, something that could change everything if she had the courage to follow it. That night, while Ethan slept with his paper crown clutched in his small hand, Maria sat at the kitchen table staring at the glow of her old laptop. The house was still, filled only with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional beep from a monitor upstairs. She typed into the search bar with trembling fingers, "New treatments for rare liver cancer, living donor transplant, options when nothing else works." Page after page appeared. Medical articles, forums of desperate families, stories that ended in heartbreak and a few that ended in hope. She scrolled until her eyes blurred, but one phrase stopped her cold: living donor liver transplant. Not the entire liver, just a portion. The liver could regenerate. It was possible for a healthy donor to give a part of theirs, and the child could live with it. Maria leaned forward, reading every word carefully. Blood type compatibility. Tissue markers. Enzyme levels. The words were complicated, but she pieced together the meaning. A relative was usually the best match. Family first. Parents, siblings. She wasn't family and she knew that. But something inside her refused to close the laptop. She bookmarked every link, then found a local clinic offering compatibility testing. Her hands shook as she filled out the form online, pressing submit just before dawn. The next morning she told Richard she needed to step out for personal business. He didn't ask questions. Maria had earned his trust long ago. At the clinic, the antiseptic smell reminded her too much of the hospital. For a moment she almost turned back, but the thought of Ethan's voice asking, "Am I going to live, Mommy?" pushed her forward. She gave her arm for blood, signed pages of consent forms, and left with a quiet prayer in her heart. The days waiting for results felt like years. Maria went on with her routine, cooking Ethan's meals, folding laundry, wiping down tables, reading him stories, but every time her phone buzzed in her pocket, her heart skipped a beat. When the message finally came, "Please return for your results," she rushed back to the clinic, her palms damp with sweat. A doctor handed her a sealed white envelope. She opened it slowly, staring at the numbers and letters like a foreign language. Her mind spun until the doctor gently explained, "You're a full match." Maria blinked, stunned. What? "Your blood type, your markers, everything aligns," the doctor said. "This is rare, especially since you're not related by blood. But it's real. You are compatible." The room tilted. Relief mixed with fear. She could give Ethan a chance at life, but would the hospital allow it? She asked for a copy of the results and went straight to the medical team caring for Ethan. She laid everything on the table. She was willing to donate, she had been tested, she was a full match. The doctors exchanged glances. One of them spoke kindly but firmly. "We understand your heart. But without a legal or blood relationship, our hospital cannot proceed. The risks are too high for our licenses, for liability. We're sorry." The words hit Maria like a blow. She sat frozen, staring at her hands to be sure they hadn't disappeared. Then she rose, bowed slightly, and walked out without speaking. If she opened her mouth, she knew tears would spill. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. Then she pulled out her phone and texted Richard, "I need to talk." They met that evening. Richard listened as she explained everything, her tests, the results, the rejection. His face went pale, his voice hoarse. "Maria, please, don't do this. I already lost my wife. I can't lose you too. Ethan needs you. I need you." She looked at him, her heart heavy. She understood his fear. It wasn't just gratitude, it was desperation, the fragile grip of a man who had already lost too much, terrified of losing more. But Maria also knew one thing for certain. Ethan's only chance was inside her. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Maria returned to her laptop. She searched again, but this time she expanded the scope. She looked for international hospitals, cases where unrelated donors had been accepted, rare exceptions where emotional bonds were considered. She read heartbreaking accounts but also hopeful ones, stories of doctors who bent the rules to save lives. At last she found a hospital overseas. Its policy stated that difficult cases would be reviewed individually, not automatically rejected. It asked for medical records, details of the patient's condition, prior treatments, donor test results, and an explanation of why the donor wished to proceed. Maria filled out the entire form, attaching her compatibility report. She stared at the submit button, her hand trembling. She thought of Ethan in his blue crown, whispering, "I want to live." She thought of the question that had silenced a birthday party. Then she pressed send. She expected to wait weeks. Instead, the next morning her inbox lit up with a new message. The subject line was short, from Dr. David Salem. The first line read, "I have reviewed the file. Can we talk today?" Maria closed her laptop slowly, pressing her hand against the lid to calm her racing heart. Somewhere upstairs, Ethan stirred in his sleep, clutching his teddy bear. One hospital had closed its doors, but perhaps another had just opened. Maria arranged her laptop on the dining table, propping her phone against a stack of books for a video call. The curtains were drawn so Ethan wouldn't wander in and overhear. When the screen lit up, she saw the calm, steady face of Dr. David Salem. His voice was measured, his eyes full of a quiet heaviness that only someone who had lived through deep loss could carry. He let Maria speak first. She told him everything, how Ethan had been diagnosed, how every treatment had failed, how she had gone to be tested and was discovered to be a perfect match, and how the hospital had turned her away because she wasn't a legal or blood relative. She admitted her fear but made it clear, she was ready to give whatever part of herself was needed. For a long moment, Dr. Salem said nothing. His silence wasn't cold, it was the silence of someone weighing her words carefully. Then he spoke, his voice softer than before. "I once lost my daughter to liver disease. We waited for a donor and it was too late. From that day forward, I promised myself I would never close the door on another child simply because of a rule." Maria's throat tightened. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady herself. Dr. Salem leaned closer to the camera. If you are healthy, if you understand the risks, and if you are truly ready, then we will review this case with utmost care. We will not turn you away because of paperwork. But everything must be discreet. We will use false names, private records, and a secluded wing of the hospital. Only those who must know will be involved. Maria nodded without hesitation. She didn't need recognition, awards, or praise. All she wanted was a real chance for Ethan. Before ending the call, Dr. Salem gave her clear instructions. Additional tests would be required to ensure her safety. Every detail had to be confirmed before they could move forward. His last words before signing off lingered in her mind. We will move quickly, but we will do this the right way. The very next day, Richard was called away for a critical international business meeting. He tried to delay it, but the partner refused to reschedule. With a heavy heart, he kissed Ethan's forehead, told Maria, "Call me anytime," and left with a suitcase that felt emptier than ever before. Maria knew this was her chance. As soon as Richard's car pulled away, she began preparing. She packed 2 bags. In Ethan's, she folded soft clothes, his favorite teddy bear, and a few slim storybooks. In her own, she placed the medical documents, her test results, and a wool scarf for the chilly nights she knew were ahead. A trusted nurse, one who had watched Ethan's battle closely, agreed to help. She arranged quiet transport, kept the plan hidden from unnecessary eyes, and whispered encouragement when Maria's hands trembled. To the rest of the household staff, Maria said only, "Ethan has a private checkup. I'll be taking him." No one questioned it. Maria had always been the one to take him everywhere. The flight was long, the steady hum of the engines blending with the faint beep of Ethan's portable monitor. He leaned against Maria's shoulder, his little body tired but his spirit steady. "Where are we going, Mommy?" he whispered. Maria stroked his bald head gently. "To a place where people will help you." He nodded, hugging his teddy bear tightly, and soon drifted into sleep. Maria stayed awake, whispering a silent prayer as she watched the faint flicker of his pulse monitor. When they arrived, the hospital's private wing was unusually quiet. No reporters, no crowded waiting areas, just staff moving quickly and softly. They checked in under the agreed false names. Tests were repeated immediately: blood type, enzyme levels, compatibility scans. Each result matched what Maria already knew: she was the perfect donor. That night, as Ethan lay in the hospital bed clutching his bear, Maria sat beside him, stroking the fine baby hair beginning to sprout back after months of treatment. He looked up at her with sleepy eyes and asked, "When I wake up, will you still be here?" Maria smiled, brushing his forehead. "I'll be right here." When he drifted off, Maria reached into her bag and pulled out a plain white envelope. She wrote in shaky handwriting, "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." She tucked it beneath his pillow. Not to frighten him, but so he would always know that what she was about to do was her choice, her love, her answer. At dawn, the halls glowed with bright white light. Nurses wheeled 2 gurneys down the corridor, one carrying Ethan, the other carrying Maria. Their beds moved side by side, separated by just a few steps. Doctors marked Maria's abdomen with ink while another nurse carefully inserted a small 4 into Ethan's hand. Dr. Salem stood between their rooms, glancing from one door to the other. With a steady nod, he gave the signal. The doors closed quietly, and the clock began keeping a different kind of time. Somewhere across the world, Richard's phone was about to ring. But here, in this quiet hospital wing, the fight for Ethan's life had just begun. The morning of the surgery began with silence. The corridors of the private hospital wing were almost still, as if the entire building knew the gravity of what was about to happen. 2 rooms had been prepared side by side, one for Ethan, one for Maria. 2 operating teams waited, their hands steady, their eyes sharp. Maria lay on her gurney, staring up at the ceiling tiles, each one blurring into the next. She thought of Ethan's small hand holding hers, of his laughter when he wore his blue crown, of the way he whispered, "I want to live." Fear tightened her chest, but beneath it was a calm resolve. She had already said yes. There was no turning back. Across the hall, Ethan lay under soft blankets, clutching his teddy bear until the anesthesia made it slip from his fingers. His tiny body looked even smaller against the wide white sheets. A nurse carefully placed the bear on the stand beside him, whispering, "It will be waiting when you wake up." Dr. Salem checked both rooms one last time. He spoke in low tones to the teams, reminding them that the margin for error was razor thin. The graft must be transferred within minutes. Sutures must be perfect. This is not about statistics, it's about a boy's life. The clock struck 8. A scalpel touched Maria's skin. The first cut was made. The room filled with the rhythm of machines, steady beeps, the hiss of ventilators, the soft voices of surgeons calling instructions. Slowly, carefully, a healthy portion of Maria's liver was separated. Every step was timed, every move rehearsed. In the room next door, Ethan's body was prepared to receive. His tiny veins were connected to machines that hummed like a quiet orchestra. The surgeons worked with a precision born from years of practice but driven by the urgency of this moment. The graft, sealed and preserved, was carried across the short distance between the two rooms. For a few seconds the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then the transplant began. Sutures, vessels, alignment, all had to be perfect. Hours turned into half a day. The surgery stretched to 13 grueling hours. No one spoke of miracles. They spoke of survival, of arteries and veins, of blood flow that had to be restored within exact limits. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Richard was finishing a business meeting when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. At first he nearly ignored it, but something made him answer. "Mr. Hayes," a voice said. "We're calling from the International Children's Liver Center. Your son is in surgery." The chair behind him clattered to the floor as Richard shot up. "What surgery? Where is he?" His voice broke with panic. The nurse on the other end explained. The hospital's name. Maria's role. In an instant the pieces came together. Maria had once told him she wanted to donate. The domestic hospital had refused. Time had been slipping away. And now she had acted. Richard didn't waste another second. He left the meeting, left the building, left everything. He booked the earliest flight and sent only one short message to Maria, knowing she wouldn't see it yet. "Please be safe." Back in the operating rooms, the final sutures were tied. Dr. Salem peeled off his gloves, sweat lining his brow, and nodded slowly. "It's done." Ethan's new liver pulsed with a faint rhythm. His color shifted, no longer pale. Machines recorded numbers that had once only declined. Now they began to rise. Hope flickered on the monitors. In the adjoining room, Maria's body was kept under deep sedation. Her vital signs were stable but fragile. The team worked quickly to close her incision and begin the long process of healing. When Richard finally arrived at the hospital late that night, exhaustion clung to his body but his heart beat with terror. He rushed through security, handed over papers, and demanded to see his son. A nurse guided him to the recovery wing. The door opened. 2 beds stood side by side. On the left lay Ethan, his small hand wrapped in bandages, eyelids twitching in dreams. On the right lay Maria, pale and still, machines breathing with her. Richard froze in the doorway, torn between the two people he loved most. Then, slowly, he walked forward and placed one hand on Ethan's, the other on Maria's. He stood between them, holding both as if his grip could bind them all together. A nurse quietly approached and placed an envelope into his palm. "We found this under Ethan's pillow," she whispered. Richard opened it and read the words, written in uneven handwriting. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." The paper blurred through his tears. He pressed it to his chest, his body shaking with sobs heavier than any he had ever known. Dr. Salem entered the room. His voice was calm, clear, and steady. "The transplant was successful. Ethan's body is accepting the new liver. His first numbers look better than we hoped. Maria will remain under sedation to recover, but the hardest part is behind us." Richard couldn't speak. He simply nodded, sinking into a chair between the 2 beds. His left hand stayed on his son's, his right on Maria's. For the first time in months he felt the faintest spark of hope. That night he didn't move from the chair. Between the beeps of machines, he whispered small things, about the garden back home, about the neighbor's dog, about the sunrise he would show Ethan once they returned. He whispered thanks to Maria though she couldn't hear. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The recovery ward carried a different kind of quiet now, less heavy, less suffocating. It was no longer the silence of waiting for bad news, but the hush of fragile hope beginning to stir. Machines beeped steadily, and sunlight streamed faintly through the blinds, painting soft stripes across the floor where Richard sat in a chair between two hospital beds. On his left, Ethan lay pale but breathing, his body holding on with a strength no 6-year-old should ever have to summon. On his right, Maria slept under sedation, her face calm, though her body bore the toll of the surgery. Richard had hardly moved since the operation ended. His suit jacket hung over the back of the chair, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Still, he kept both of his hands occupied, his left resting gently on Ethan's, his right wrapped firmly around Maria's. He was the link between them, unwilling to let go of either. Inside his pocket sat the letter, folded and worn from his constant touch. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." Those words replayed in his mind with every blink, a mixture of heartbreak and gratitude. By morning, the doctors reviewed Ethan's labs. For the first time in months, his numbers were moving in the right direction. His liver enzymes, which had been climbing uncontrollably, had begun to fall. His skin no longer carried the gray tint of illness but showed the faintest flush of pink. A nurse leaned close to Richard and whispered, "We've seen children make it back from this point. Hope has a way of showing up when you least expect it." Richard managed a tired smile, thin but real. That afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the room, Richard dozed off in his chair. A sudden twitch jolted him awake. He looked down at Maria's hand and for a split second, he thought he imagined it. But then her finger curled faintly against his palm. Reflex or not, it was enough to bring tears to his eyes. He bent forward, whispering thanks, to God, to the doctors, to Maria, for giving them this chance. 2 days later, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Ethan's eyelids fluttered, his lashes trembling against his cheeks. Richard leaned forward, holding his breath as his son's lips parted and a raspy whisper slipped out, "Daddy, I want cake." The words nearly knocked Richard off his chair. He let out a laugh that broke into tears, calling for the nurses. They rushed in, smiling as they checked his vitals, nodding as the numbers confirmed what they hoped. Ethan was stabilizing. His little body was accepting the new liver. The first thing Ethan asked after a sip of water wasn't about himself. It was, "Where's Mommy number 2? His voice was weak but steady, filled with trust. Richard squeezed his hand and said softly, "She's resting, son. She's very tired, but she's here." Ethan nodded, reassured. For him, those words, "she's here," were all he needed to know. Later that day, a nurse placed a small blue paper crown on Ethan's head, the same kind he wore at his birthday party. "The king of recovery," she teased gently. Ethan smiled, faint but glowing, and even the staff who had seen countless battles between sickness and survival couldn't help but laugh softly. Meanwhile, Maria remained asleep in the room next door, her body still healing from the ordeal. Richard visited her often, sometimes with Ethan's teddy bear in hand, sometimes with updates whispered just above her ear. "Ethan asked about you. He's smiling again. The doctors say things are looking good." He pulled the letter from his pocket one evening, smoothing the creases as he read it again. "This will never leave our home. It'll be framed so everyone knows the choice you made, the reason my boy still breathes." Outside, the story had already escaped the walls of the hospital. What began as quiet murmurs among nurses spread into corridors, then leaked beyond. An anonymous post appeared online, followed quickly by headlines, "Maid donates liver to save billionaire's son." Social media buzzed with praise, outrage, and questions. Why had the original hospital turned her away? How could regulations refuse when love had given the answer? Medical boards began to reconsider policies. Debates grew heated. But inside the hospital, none of that mattered. For Richard, for Ethan, for Maria, this wasn't about headlines. It was about survival. On the 5th day after surgery, the miracle everyone prayed for came. At first just a long blink. Then a flutter. Then slowly Maria's eyes opened. Nurses hurried in to check her vitals, their relief barely hidden. Richard was at her side in an instant, his hand tight around hers. "You're here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You made it." Later, Ethan was wheeled into her room, still wearing his paper crown, his face brighter than it had been in months. He gripped the side of her bed with both hands, his voice trembling as he said, "Mommy number 2, you're alive." Maria's lips moved, tears sliding down her cheeks before words could form. Her weak hand reached for Ethan's, and he pressed his tiny fingers into hers with all the strength he had. By evening, Dr. Salem walked in with fresh reports. His voice was steady, no longer weighed with caution. "The tumor is shrinking. The new liver is working. The medicines are finally doing what they're supposed to. The road ahead will be long, but we're on the right path." Richard lowered his head, unable to hold back the tears. He reached across the bed, clasping both Maria's hand and Ethan's in his own. In that moment there were no titles. No billionaire, no maid, no lines of class or status. There was only a father, a child, and a woman who had become a mother by choice. Together they had turned despair into hope. The days after Maria first opened her eyes moved slowly, yet each hour felt like progress. Nurses came in and out, checking vitals, changing 4 lines, whispering small encouragements. Ethan was wheeled in for short visits, always wearing his paper crown. Every time he entered the room, Maria's weak smile grew wider, as though his very presence was her medicine. Richard stayed constantly between the 2 rooms, moving from Ethan's bedside to Maria's and back again. He carried the letter with him everywhere, unfolding it in the quiet hours when exhaustion dragged him down. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." He read those words again and again, each time realizing that Maria had risked her life not because of duty, but because of love. Outside their walls, the story was no longer just a whisper. News outlets across the country picked it up. Headlines filled the internet. Maid donates liver to billionaire's son, hospital rules questioned. Social media exploded with opinions. Some praised Maria as a hero beyond words. Others demanded to know why the first hospital had refused her. Politicians began weighing in, and medical boards announced they were reviewing policies. In some cities, hospitals added new lines to their living donor checklists. Assess emotional relationship before refusal. But for Richard, none of that mattered. The world could debate, argue, or write laws. What mattered was in these rooms, his son recovering and Maria slowly regaining strength. Ethan's progress was steady. Each day he ate a little more, his cheeks flushed with color, his laughter returning. He asked when he could walk again, when he could run, when he could go home. His questions were simple but filled with hope, and every one of them felt like a milestone. Nurses called him a fighter. Richard called him his miracle. Maria's journey back was slower. She often drifted in and out of sleep, her body healing from the ordeal. At times, confusion clouded her face and she would whisper, "Where am I?" The nurses explained gently, and Richard was always there to remind her, "You're safe. You're with us." Each time she nodded weakly, her hand instinctively searching for Ethan's. One afternoon, Ethan brought a crayon drawing to her room. In it, 3 figures stood side by side, holding hands. Above them floated a blue crown. "That's me, that's Daddy, and that's you," he explained proudly. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she traced the shaky lines of his drawing with her finger. Richard watched quietly from the corner. He realized then that his son didn't see Maria as the maid or Mommy number 2. To Ethan she was simply Mommy. No title, no explanation, just the truth of who she had become. Letters began to arrive at the hospital, some handwritten, some typed. An elderly woman from another state wrote, "You remind me of the daughter I lost. Thank you for giving that boy what I could not give my own." A young boy wrote in crayon, "When I grow up, I want to be a doctor so kids don't have to wait like Ethan did." Richard collected every letter, saving them in a box to show Ethan and Maria when they were stronger. Invitations also began pouring in, offers for interviews, awards, forums, even TV appearances. Richard showed them to Maria once she was more awake. She shook her head slowly, whispering, "I don't need any of that. I just need him home." Richard didn't argue. He knew she meant it. So the invitations piled into a drawer, answered only with a simple note of thanks. "Our family is grateful, but please allow us silence." Day by day, silence became their medicine. Ethan's stitches healed, Maria's strength returned, and the charts on the wall slowly brightened with better numbers. By the 3rd week, Ethan was walking small steps down the hallway, holding Richard's hand on one side and Maria's on the other. Nurses paused to watch, smiling as if witnessing a parade of hope. One morning, sunlight streamed through the windows brighter than before. Maria was transferred out of intensive care into a regular recovery room. Ethan was allowed to walk, just a few steps but steps nonetheless, into her room. He ran as much as his tiny legs and the doctors would allow, stopping just short of the bed. He stretched his arms wide, breathless but grinning, and said, "When can we go home?" Richard looked at both of them, his son standing tall, his surrogate mother sitting up in bed, and for the first time in months he dared to answer with certainty. Soon. Homecoming was something Richard had barely allowed himself to imagine. 4 months, the mansion had felt more like a museum of grief than a place where a child could laugh. Medical equipment had cluttered every corner, antiseptic smells lingered in the air, and silence weighed heavy in every room. But now, with both Ethan and Maria showing steady improvement, the doctors finally gave permission. They could go home. The day they left the hospital, nurses and staff lined the hallway, smiling and waving. Ethan, holding Maria's hand, walked slowly but proudly, his blue crown perched on his head. Maria's steps were careful, her body still sore, but her eyes sparkled as she looked at him. For the first time in months, Richard's heart felt lighter as he walked behind them, his hand ready to steady either one at any moment. When the front doors of the mansion opened, the house was transformed. Gone were the 4 poles and boxes of syringes. The scent of disinfectant had been replaced with the warm smell of baked bread, prepared by the staff who had quietly celebrated their return. Balloons hung in clusters along the staircase. On the dining table, a welcome home cake waited, its frosting decorated with stars and a small paper crown pressed into the top. Ethan clapped his hands, his laugh echoing through the grand halls. For the first time in so long, the house felt alive again. Maria sat on the sofa, carefully lowering herself, while Ethan curled up beside her with his teddy bear. Richard stood near the doorway just watching. 4 years he had thought of the mansion as a monument to his success. Now he saw it for what it was, a home alive only because of the people inside it. The first days at home were slow but filled with joy. Ethan returned to his little routines, coloring books at the kitchen table, watching cartoons in the living room, and following Maria around with endless chatter. Maria returned to her quiet caretaking, reminding him to take small bites, brushing his hair gently, and tucking him in at night with the same patience she always had. But this time something was different. Her bond with Ethan wasn't hidden or brushed aside. Even Richard, once firm about employees being staff, no longer tried to draw that line. One evening, as Ethan painted with his new watercolor set, he proudly held up a picture. 3 figures stood together, hand in hand, beneath a paper crown floating above their heads. "That's us," he explained with a grin. "Mommy, Daddy, and me." Maria's eyes brimmed with tears. Richard swallowed hard, realizing that Ethan no longer saw her as Mommy number 2. To him she was simply Mommy. Richard had changed too. The months of fear had stripped him of the illusion that money could control everything. He spent less time on business calls and more time sitting on the living room floor, helping Ethan with puzzles or listening to Maria's quiet stories. Each night, he checked on both of them before bed, standing silently at the doorway, grateful for every breath they took. Outside their home, the story continued to spread. More letters arrived, some from families who had faced similar battles, others from strangers moved by Maria's courage. Hospitals across the country debated policy changes. A few even suspended directors who had refused cases like Ethan's. Medical boards added new guidelines. Consider emotional bonds when reviewing donors. Maria's act had sparked more than healing, it had started a change. But inside the Hayes home, none of that noise mattered. Their lives shrank down to the simple moments that mattered most. Ethan giggling as Maria brushed his hair, Richard burning toast while trying to cook breakfast, the 3 of them sitting on the couch together watching cartoons. These small things, once taken for granted, now felt like treasures. On the weekend, Richard surprised Ethan with something special. He decorated the living room with balloons in yellow, blue, and purple, invited a handful of close friends, and brought out a cake shaped like the number 7. Ethan's eyes widened when he saw it. He wore a bright yellow outfit, his cheeks round with health, his hair just beginning to curl back in. Maria helped him stand in front of the cake, steadying his shoulders. When everyone counted down, 3, 2, 1, Ethan took a deep breath and blew out the candles. Applause filled the room. Laughter bounced off the walls. Richard's chest ached with joy as he captured the moment on video, his hands trembling from the weight of what this birthday meant. Maria bent and kissed the top of Ethan's head, the scent of children's shampoo filling her lungs. For the first time she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She didn't need recognition or titles. She had already been given what mattered most, the chance to watch Ethan live. As the party wound down and the children played with balloons, Ethan turned to Maria with the same serious expression he'd worn months earlier in the hospital. "Mommy," he said, his voice soft but steady, "now I'm really going to live, right?" Maria dropped to her knees, pressing her forehead against his small hands. Her voice was full of certainty. "Yes, Ethan. You're going to live." And for the first time in months, every person in the room believed it completely. The weeks that followed felt like a second chance at life for the Hayes family. The mansion, once filled with shadows of fear, now echoed with laughter, footsteps, and the small sounds of ordinary living, sounds Richard realized he had long taken for granted. Ethan's recovery was steady, though every step forward was measured carefully. Doctors prescribed gentle routines, regular checkups, and a strict diet. Maria managed every detail, keeping charts on the refrigerator, taping reminders to the walls, and quietly making sure nothing was forgotten. Ethan adjusted well. His strength returned little by little. At first, it was just walking across the living room without stopping to catch his breath. Then it was climbing the staircase step by step with Maria by his side. Each small victory brought cheers from Richard, who clapped as if his son had just won a marathon. Ethan would laugh, shaking his head, embarrassed but happy. One afternoon, Richard came home early from the office. He walked into the living room to find Ethan curled up on the couch, resting his head in Maria's lap while she read from a storybook. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Ethan's eyes were half closed, his hand clutching Maria's arm as though anchoring himself to her. Richard felt his throat tighten. For so long he had clung to the rule that employees were not family. But here, right in front of him, was proof that some bonds can't be defined by titles or contracts. Maria noticed him standing in the doorway and smiled softly. She didn't say anything, but her eyes seemed to ask if he was finally ready to accept what Ethan had known all along. Richard gave a small nod. In that moment he let go of the invisible line he had drawn for years. Outside their home, the noise around Maria's sacrifice grew louder. News outlets continued to cover the story, some calling her the woman who rewrote the rules of medicine. Campaigns advocating for changes in organ donation policies cited her case as proof that love, not just blood, should determine who can give life. Petitions gathered thousands of signatures. Medical journals debated ethics. A hospital administrator who had rejected Maria's offer months earlier resigned under public pressure. But inside the mansion none of that mattered to them. Their world had narrowed into a small circle of three: father, son, and the woman who had stepped into the role of mother by choice. Letters continued to arrive, stacked higher each week. One was from a teenager who wrote, "When I read your story, I decided to sign up as an organ donor. You saved more than one life." Another came from a grieving father who had lost his daughter, saying, "You gave the world what I could not, hope." Richard gathered all the letters into a wooden box he kept in the living room, saving them for a time when Ethan would be old enough to understand what Maria had done for him. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Richard and Maria sat together at the kitchen table. Between them was a pot of tea, steam curling into the quiet air. Richard broke the silence first. "You didn't just save Ethan. You saved me too." His voice cracked slightly. "I thought I had everything because I had money. But I didn't know what it meant to really have a home until now." Maria lowered her eyes, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because no child should have to face what Ethan was facing. Not when I could do something." Richard nodded. "And you're not just someone who worked here. You're family. I was wrong to ever think otherwise." Maria's eyes glistened, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, the truth already clear. Meanwhile, Ethan was blossoming. He returned to painting, filling pages with colorful images. Many of his drawings showed three figures together: himself, Richard, and Maria, with crowns floating above their heads. One evening, he handed one of his paintings to Richard. "This is us," he said proudly. "We're all wearing crowns because we're a team. Richard looked at the uneven brushstrokes and felt his chest tighten with emotion. He hung the picture on the wall above the fireplace, where everyone who entered the house could see it. The house, once filled with loneliness, had become a place of warmth. Meals were eaten together. Laughter filled the halls at night. Even the staff seemed lighter, no longer walking on eggshells but joining in the renewed joy of the household. Yet, beneath all the happiness, Richard sometimes caught Maria staring quietly at Ethan when she thought no one was looking. Her eyes would soften, but there was always a shadow of fear of what could have happened, fear of losing him even now. She carried the memory of her little brother who hadn't been saved, and that loss made her cherish Ethan's life even more fiercely. Richard noticed. One evening as they tucked Ethan into bed, Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's going to be okay," he said quietly. "And you're not carrying this alone anymore." Maria met his gaze, her eyes shining with gratitude. She didn't need to reply. The truth was already between them. And as Ethan drifted to sleep, clutching his teddy bear, the house filled with a peace they hadn't known in years. Life at home began to follow a new rhythm. Gone were the sterile routines of the hospital and the constant fear that each day might be the last. Instead, mornings started with the smell of pancakes, afternoons were filled with soft laughter, and evenings ended with storybooks and whispered goodnights. Richard marveled at how ordinary life suddenly felt extraordinary. Every giggle, every step Ethan took was like a small miracle. Ethan grew stronger each week. His cheeks filled out, his laughter returned, and his hair began to curl back over his head. He no longer looked like a child haunted by illness but like the lively boy Richard remembered before the diagnosis. He started asking questions about school, about friends, even about sports he wanted to try once the doctors cleared him. Each question filled the house with hope for a future that once seemed impossible. Maria became the quiet anchor holding it all together. She managed Ethan's medications, kept his diet on track, and gently reminded him not to push himself too hard. But she also gave him the freedom to feel like a child again. She organized small painting sessions at the kitchen table, took him for short walks in the garden, and filled his afternoons with simple joys. Ethan never let go of her hand. Even in moments of excitement, his first glance was always toward her, seeking her smile of reassurance. Richard noticed the bond more clearly than ever. At times, it stung to realize that Ethan instinctively turned to Maria with questions he once would have asked a mother. But instead of jealousy, Richard now felt gratitude. Maria had given Ethan something he could never replace on his own, the comfort of a mother's love. One night after dinner, Richard walked into the living room and found Ethan lying across Maria's lap, half asleep, while she hummed softly and brushed his hair. The scene pierced Richard's heart. For years, he had told himself that Maria was simply staff. But here she was, giving Ethan what no job title could define. Richard quietly sat beside them, laying his hand gently over Ethan's foot. He whispered, "Thank you," and Maria met his eyes, understanding without needing words. Beyond the mansion walls, their story continued to ripple. News stations aired features about Maria's sacrifice. Medical organizations held debates, pointing to her case as evidence that emotional bonds must be considered when approving organ donations. Hospitals in several states quietly changed policies, allowing unrelated but emotionally significant donors to be evaluated. Some even called it the Lopez Clause, though Maria never asked for her name to be attached. Letters kept pouring in. Families sent photos of children who had survived transplants, thanking Maria for inspiring them to keep fighting. A young woman wrote, "I was afraid to sign up as an organ donor until I read about you. Now I know love is enough reason." Richard kept every letter in the same wooden box, telling himself that one day, when Ethan was old enough, he would read them all and understand the magnitude of what Maria had done. But for now, life was focused on the small moments. Richard found himself spending less time buried in contracts and more time at home. He cut meetings short to be there for dinner. He turned down business trips to attend Ethan's checkups. He had spent years chasing success, but now he realized success meant nothing if he wasn't present for his son. One Saturday morning, Richard surprised both Ethan and Maria. He took them into the backyard where a small tent had been set up, decorated with fairy lights. "We're camping tonight," he announced with a grin. Ethan's eyes lit up. He had never been camping before. They roasted marshmallows over a small fire pit, told stories under the stars, and laughed until Ethan fell asleep in his sleeping bag, his head resting between Maria and Richard. In that moment, under the open night sky, the three of them felt less like a household held together by tragedy and more like a true family. Inside the mansion, the framed letter hung on the wall near the living room. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." Visitors paused to read it, often leaving in silence, moved by its raw truth. For Richard, it was more than a reminder, it was a symbol of the courage that had saved his son's life. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Richard found Maria lingering in front of the frame. She traced the glass lightly with her fingers, her expression distant. "When I wrote this, I didn't know if I'd ever see him again," she whispered. Richard stepped closer, his voice soft. "That note gave me hope when I thought I had none. And because of you he's here. Because of you we're all here." Maria turned, her eyes shining. "I just did what I had to do." "No," Richard said firmly. "You did what most people wouldn't have had the courage to do. You gave him life when everyone else had given up." Maria lowered her gaze, humbled, but the truth of his words settled deep in her heart. As weeks turned into months, the shadow of illness began to fade. The fear was not completely gone. Checkups and lab results still loomed large, but hope had taken its place. For the first time in a long while, they weren't counting down the days. They were living them. As the weeks passed, the Hayes household settled into something Richard hadn't felt in years: normalcy. Ethan's laughter once again echoed down the long hallways, turning the mansion from a hollow shell into a real home. The staff, who once tiptoed through the house with somber faces, now shared in the joy, often pausing to watch Ethan's small triumphs, climbing stairs without help, painting bold strokes with his watercolors, or running short distances across the yard with Maria by his side. But outside their quiet walls, the world was not silent. Maria's story had grown far beyond their home. National news outlets followed her every update, running features with titles like "The Maid Who Saved a Billionaire's Son" or "A Hero Without a Title." Talk shows debated her act of sacrifice, some praising her as proof of human goodness, others dissecting the failures of a system that had nearly cost a child his life. For Maria, the attention was overwhelming. She never sought fame. Her only wish was to see Ethan alive. One afternoon, Richard sat at the dining room table, reading a stack of invitations that had arrived in the mail. Award ceremonies, charity banquets, even government panels requested Maria's presence. He pushed the papers aside with a sigh. Later that evening he brought them to her. "You don't have to go to any of these," he said gently. "They want to call you a hero, but I know that's not why you did it." Maria smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. "They can call me what they want, but I only wanted to save him. That's all that matters." Richard studied her, humbled by her simplicity. "Still," he added, "the world deserves to know what real courage looks like." Maria shook her head. "The world already knows. Ethan is alive. That's enough." While Maria avoided the spotlight, Ethan continued to thrive. Each day he grew stronger, his stamina returning, his energy overflowing. His doctors marveled at the recovery, calling it remarkable. At home, he became a whirlwind of curiosity again, asking endless questions about the stars, dinosaurs, and why birds could fly but people couldn't. Richard often chuckled, reminded of how much he had missed the simple joy of answering a child's endless whys. One evening, after a checkup at the hospital, Dr. Salem met privately with Richard and Maria. He spoke calmly but with pride. "Ethan's progress is better than expected. His body has fully accepted the liver. His chances for a long, healthy life are very strong now. There will still be checkups, but the danger we feared has passed." Maria covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. Richard placed an arm around her shoulders, his own eyes wet. For months, their lives had been dominated by fear of death. Now the doctor's words opened a door they had nearly stopped believing existed, a door to the future. Back at home that night, Ethan insisted on celebrating. He dragged Maria and Richard into the kitchen, demanding they bake a cake together. Richard, who had never cracked an egg in his life, made a mess of the counter, while Maria laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks. Ethan, with flour dusting his nose, declared himself the chef of the house. By the time the cake was finished, lopsided and unevenly frosted, it tasted better than any dessert Richard had ever eaten in his life. As the days rolled on, Richard noticed something changing inside himself. He had always defined success by boardrooms, deals, and wealth. But now, success looked like evenings spent helping Ethan with puzzles, mornings of burnt toast at the kitchen table, and the quiet strength of Maria sitting beside him when the world grew heavy. He realized he was no longer living for the next deal, he was living for them. Yet, there were still moments when Maria carried the weight of her own past. Richard once found her in the garden late at night, standing beneath the stars. When he asked what she was thinking, she whispered, "My little brother. He didn't get a chance like Ethan. Sometimes I wonder why him and not my brother." Her voice trembled, raw with grief. Richard stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I don't have an answer for that. But I know this, because of you, Ethan has a future. And maybe in some way your brother's spirit lives on in him." Maria closed her eyes, her tears falling silently. Richard stayed by her side until the cool night breeze no longer felt heavy but soothing. One weekend, Ethan had a small gathering with children from the neighborhood. Balloons floated in the backyard, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. Watching Ethan run, Maria sitting nearby with a proud smile, Richard realized how far they had come. For months ago he feared he would lose his son. 2 months ago he nearly did. But now here they were, alive, together, and stronger than ever. In those moments, Richard knew that the word family had changed for him forever. It was no longer about bloodlines or names. It was about love, sacrifice, and the people who chose to stand beside you when the world fell apart. The story of Maria's sacrifice had spread far beyond what anyone could have expected. What began as a quiet act of love had turned into a movement. Newspapers continued to run articles, documentaries were in production, and her name had become synonymous with selflessness. Some even called her the woman who redefined family. Invitations kept arriving daily, requests to speak at medical conferences, to appear on television, to accept awards. Richard often opened the envelopes himself, setting them aside with a sigh. He respected Maria's wish to stay private, but the world's fascination was relentless. One evening he sat across from her at the dining table, holding a gold-trimmed invitation to a national awards ceremony. "They want to honor you," he said softly. "But I know what your answer will be." Maria smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I don't need a medal. The only award I wanted is upstairs, drawing pictures and asking for extra dessert." Richard chuckled, his heart warming. He's already planning his next cake design. Indeed, Ethan's recovery had blossomed into a celebration of life. His days were filled with schoolwork, play, and laughter. His hair had grown back, curling messily, his cheeks were full of color, and his energy seemed boundless. He often ran around the house with Maria chasing him, pretending to be the villain in his superhero games. Richard sometimes joined in, laughing as he played the role of the monster Ethan had to defeat. The mansion had transformed completely. Once sterile and quiet, it now vibrated with joy. The kitchen smelled of pancakes in the morning, the living room echoed with giggles in the afternoon, and the evenings ended with shared stories and prayers. Even the staff seemed changed, moving through the halls with smiles instead of hushed tones. But the outside world didn't stop knocking. News cameras often waited at the gates. Advocates campaigned for new laws called Maria's Law, designed to ensure that unrelated but emotionally bonded donors would never again be turned away. For Maria, it felt strange to see her name on billboards and in headlines when all she wanted was a quiet life with Ethan and Richard. One afternoon, while Ethan was napping, Maria sat in the garden with Richard. The autumn air was crisp and golden leaves floated down from the trees. She watched them fall, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I never imagined my life would become this," she whispered. "I was just a woman working to provide for my family. I never thought the world would even know my name." Richard looked at her with a quiet seriousness. "The world knows your name because you did what very few would have had the courage to do. You gave my son a second chance. And you gave me a second chance too. Maria's eyes glistened. I don't feel like a hero, Richard. I just feel grateful that he's alive, that I got to be part of his life. Richard nodded, his voice thick with emotion. You're more than part of his life. You're his life. And mine too, if I'm honest. They sat in silence for a while, watching Ethan sleep through the window, his small body curled under blankets, his chest rising and falling steadily. Weeks later, the family received an official letter from the medical board. It confirmed that new guidelines had been approved, inspired directly by Maria's case. Donors who shared an emotional bond with a patient would now be evaluated with the same seriousness as relatives. The letter called Maria's act a precedent that changed the landscape of organ donation. Richard read it aloud in the living room, his voice breaking at the end. Ethan, sitting cross-legged on the floor with crayons, looked up and asked, "Does that mean other kids like me can live now?" Maria knelt beside him, cupping his cheek gently. "Yes, baby. It means more children will get to grow up just like you." Ethan smiled, pressing his paper crown onto her head. "Then you really are a hero, Mommy." Maria's tears fell freely as she hugged him close. Richard stood nearby, his chest aching with gratitude, knowing that Ethan had spoken the truth. That night, Richard walked past the framed letter hanging on the wall. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." He paused, touching the glass. The note wasn't just a reminder of what they had almost lost, it was a symbol of what they had gained. The world outside could debate policies and celebrate heroes, but inside the mansion, life was defined by smaller, truer victories. Ethan's laughter, Maria's steady presence, and the chance to look forward to tomorrow without fear. For Richard, it was the first time he understood what legacy truly meant. It wasn't about wealth, companies, or success. It was about the lives you touched, the love you gave, and the hope you left behind. The winter air was crisp when the Hayes family stepped out together for the first time in months without fear. Ethan walked between Richard and Maria, his small hands clutching theirs tightly. His cheeks were rosy, his eyes bright with energy, and his paper crown sat proudly on his head. For passers-by, they looked like any other family out for a stroll. But for Richard and Maria, every step Ethan took was a victory, every laugh a miracle. Back at home, the wooden box of letters continued to grow. Families, strangers, doctors, even children sent their words of thanks. Some shared stories of their own struggles. Others wrote simply to say that Maria's courage had inspired them to sign up as organ donors. Each letter was a reminder that one act of love could ripple far beyond what anyone imagined. Richard often found himself standing in front of the framed note on the wall. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." He traced the words with his fingers, his heart swelling with gratitude. That note had once been a farewell. Now it was a testament to life, courage, and sacrifice. Ethan grew stronger by the day. His doctors declared his recovery remarkable, and he began preparing to return to school. He looked forward to recess, to seeing friends, to living the simple life he once feared he'd never get back. At night, he often whispered to Maria, "Thank you, Mommy," before falling asleep. Each time, her tears would soak the pillow, not of sorrow but of overwhelming joy. Richard changed too. The man who once measured his worth in deals and numbers now measured it in laughter and family dinners. He no longer introduced Maria as staff. To anyone who asked, she was family, because that's what she had always been. The outside world never stopped telling their story. News outlets continued to feature Maria's act, and laws inspired by her sacrifice were passed in several states. People across the country referred to the change as Maria's legacy. Yet inside the mansion, life had become beautifully ordinary. The three of them shared meals, built puzzles, argued playfully over board games, and celebrated the small victories of each day. One quiet evening, Richard stood on the balcony with Maria, watching Ethan chase fireflies in the garden below. His laughter echoed in the cool night air. Richard turned to her and said softly, "I used to think my wealth was my legacy. But now I know, it's this. That's what I'll leave behind." Maria didn't answer with words. She simply smiled, her hand resting over his. They both watched as Ethan caught a firefly and released it, his laughter rising to the stars. And so, what began with fear and despair ended with life and hope. A little boy who had once been given months to live now had years ahead of him. A woman who was once dismissed as just staff had become the heart of a family. And a man who thought money defined everything had discovered that love was the only true measure of wealth. As their story closed one chapter and opened another, it left behind a lesson larger than their own lives, that courage is not found in power but in sacrifice. That family is not only who you're born to, but who stands beside you when it matters most. And that hope, no matter how fragile, can change the world. So if you're listening to their story now, carry it with you. Cherish your loved ones. Be present in their lives. And when the chance comes to show kindness, choose yes. Because sometimes one act of love can save not just a life, but generations. And for Ethan, Maria, and Richard, that act of love had turned what could have been an ending into a beginning. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Take a moment to share it with someone you love, because sometimes a reminder of hope and courage is exactly what they need. And if you want to hear more stories that celebrate family, sacrifice, and the power of love, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Remember, life isn't about what we own but about the love we give and the people we stand by. Be the reason someone believes in kindness today.